Thank you again for being here. And we're excited to have Taniya Bethke, Director of Operations of the Council to Advance Hunting and the Shooting Sports, as well as Matt Dunfee, Director of Special Programs at the Wildlife Management Institute. They both are guest speakers today on our SEAFWA gathering call. Today is more of a training than our monthly call. They're going to lead us into a stakeholder facilitation training. And if you all have any ideas, questions of your own partner engagement or summits as we go along, feel free to ask or drop those in the chat too. Both Taniya and Matt are a wealth of knowledge, so thankful that they could be here today. Also too, I learned that they have a ton of different memes within their PowerPoint, so you guys are in luck with that. Also too, this training was developed for you. It came highly recommended from most of you all within the region, so I'm glad we could have the training today and also the follow-up training next month too. But I'm going to go ahead and give it over to Taniya to do a quick overview of what today's going to look like.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here with you. It's really exciting. We've got folks working as a region to identify key needs so that we, Matt and myself and others in our area can really work towards meeting those specific needs to enhance the ability for you all to deliver R3 on the ground. Today is about how to figure out if you need an R3 Partner Summit. For a long time, our community has kind of viewed R3 Partner Summits as a checklist item. You got to have your partner summit, but there's some decisions that need to go into that and infrastructure that needs to be in place in order for a partner summit to happen. And there's some key considerations that Matt and I are going to cover here during this hour that we hope that you're thinking about as you're deciding whether you need a partner summit and what other kinds of partner engagement that you might want to consider. So today we're going to get through the decision-making process for what kind of partner engagement you want and why you would want one. During our next session that Olivia mentioned happening in November, Matt and I are going to be talking about how we then design meaningful objectives for those partner summits when they do happen and agendas that support those objectives. So this is really fun to be able to create a relationship that's lasting like this and hope that this continues to be something that we can develop and serve you through into the future if there's any other needs that you'd like. So with that, would love to hand this over to Matt to kick us off with our opening activities. And again, we encourage conversation, questions, and of course, random comments about whatever memes might strike your fancy. Take it away.
Taniya. All right. Well, folks, first I want to say we've got an hour here. Actually, we've got a little less than an hour. And neither Taniya or I take ourselves very seriously, and we don't have fun unless you're having fun or at least engaged. So here's my first ask. When we ask you to get involved, which I'm about to do here, please don't be sitting there watching YouTube videos, or just please push pause and engage real quick and pretend like you care and that you're there, and then we'll feel really good about ourselves and we'll probably deliver a better program. So in that hour, we just don't have a whole lot of time to pull stuff out of you all. So please engage and even interrupt as we're going through this, because at the end of the day, Taniya and I we took this in a totally different direction, honestly, than Olivia really had in mind, because of what we've seen and experienced trying to do this stuff in the real world. So we're about the implementation of this stuff, not the theory of this stuff, and we can't get that implementation across unless you all are engaged with us. So here's where Taniya and I would like to start, because we realized when we were talking about this, we didn't know what we were talking about either. So when you hear R3 Stakeholder Summit, let's try to define that. I'm interested in, when you hear that phrase, what pops in your head? If you had to define what one of those are to your director, to your colleague, what would you say? Somebody just jump in.
I guess getting everybody at the table is my first thought that pops into my head. Everybody that's a player, whether it be, government, non-government, partnerships, industry, just everybody that's going the same direction in the state, pretty much.
So Matt, when you say everybody, give me a number. How many is everybody?
Gosh, it's funny you say that. I just got done talking to somebody about putting this on next year, fall of next year. And we're just kind of working out that list of who we want to invite, of course. And, when I start thinking about it, I'm thinking like 20, 30 different groups might be involved. I mean, that's kind of, rough estimate in my head, but yeah, that's where I'm at right now anyway.
Gotcha. So big event, big forum, lots of people, lots of different partners. You said like NGO, industry, agency. Okay, so pretty big. Others, is that how you think about it, or you think about it a little bit differently when you hear a partner summit? Warnke, what comes into your head? Keith.
Well, I'm not in the Southeast. I didn't want to take anybody's time, but
I don't care. So just speak.
Well, the important part when you're thinking about a stakeholder summit is first, to me, carefully delineating what the summit topic is. Because if you say we're going to have a stakeholder summit, you could end up with 200, 250 different groups there. But if you're going to carefully delineate, even now, it's R3, maybe even more concise than R3, to me, that's going to create something that has a better probability of success.
Okay, so I'm hearing you're still thinking R3 stakeholders, but it's constrained by mission, and the number of people that are there somewhat constrained by what your objectives are. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got to be clear about your objectives.
Yeah, good thought. Others. When you think about a stakeholder summit, what does this thing look like?
It looks like David dropped a comment in the chat saying stakeholders are those who stand to benefit from an activity.
Agreed.
Tell us more, David. We've got some recent relevant experience here. You and Jason. Cough, cough.
When you start talking,
go ahead. Yeah, good. Go ahead.
When you start talking about a stakeholder summit, is bringing those again that stand to benefit together to talk about strategies that can be executed again that will reap some of the value from folks engaging in hunting, fishing, boating, and so on and so forth. But it's coming together to develop or to share some concise strategies and actions and goals and so on and so forth. So everybody's marching somewhat in lockstep.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing that you added there, David, that I think is really important is we're bringing together folks that have a stake in R3, and they're there to do some work. They're there to do something, develop some strategies, network with each other, do some actionable things that helps them as an organization and conceivably everybody else. Is that fair?
That's pretty spot on.
Okay. So what about, here's where I'd like to get your brains going. I think all that is true. What are other kinds of partner or stakeholder engagement relative to R3, aside from this thing that we've sort of loosely defined? Can you think of anything else you all have done that isn't that we've defined, but is really partner engagement?
Do you mean outside of R3?
No, I'm thinking within R3, at least that let's constrain the topic, at least for now, because that's sort of the focus of this webinar.
So every time you guys interact with stakeholders, it's not always a summit, right? What are some of the other things that you do?
Say like workshops, like collaborative partnerships.
Okay. Becky? Becky, I saw you come off mute. Wasn't sure if you were going to talk there. Okay, well, we're still warming up. So remember my plea to you in the beginning, want some engagement. At the end of this, we're going to leave some time open for discussion as well as questions and answers. What I'd like you all to think about, and maybe just expand your brains a little bit before we start talking specifically about this R3 Summit concept, is all of the other things that your partner groups might need beyond a summit, all of the things that you might be doing that achieve certain R3 goals with specific partners that aren't part of an official summit. Okay, there's probably a broad range of things you all do that you might not be counting as partner engagement. And I think it's worth thinking about, what do you as an organization need right now? What capacity do you have to engage with your partners for their good and yours? And what's realistic to do for where your agency is right now and your capacity to manage all those partnerships? So keep that in mind, and let's dive in here a little bit. I'm going to share my screen and share with you what our definition of an R3 Summit is. I think we're all fairly close. Okay, Olivia, can you see my screen?
I can. I see like
Okay.
your extra slides. There you go.
Excellent.
Yep. Beautiful.
All right. So now this is a draft. You all can tell me if you agree with this. But when I think of a R3 Stakeholder Summit, I'm thinking of these aspects. Taniya and I both looked at this, and this is fairly close. It may need some tweaking, but basically all of your big priority, and there's a lot involved in that priority we'll talk about. R3 vested organizations, you get together for specific purposes of getting their help, informing them of what your expectations are and your future engagement expectations are, as well as theirs, and then creating collaboration within and among those attendees. Now, based on the couple of you that responded to the first questions, that seems like we're in pretty good lockstep with what you're thinking. It's this large scale thing, pretty big production, a lot of individual groups in the room, a lot of dynamics going on to do some work about what's happening today and what might happen in the future. Does anybody disagree with that definition? Okay.
Hey, Matt.
Well,
I don't
go ahead.
disagree with it. I think it's broader than that. I think there's a 30,000-foot view of what you're trying to do with these meetings. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my head around it. So
Yeah.
we're, we have an overall R3 plan that's even bigger than that in some cases in some agencies. And educating our NGOs and educating our stakeholders of that plan, I think, is imperative on a larger scale before we go in there and start asking for stuff.
Okay, so what you're saying is when you as an agency have figured out what you're going to do, when you have this plan, there's a need to inform all of your partners at a really broad scale of what that plan is. Is that what you're saying?
On a conservation era, on an R3 era. I mean, there's so many things that we're doing as an agency that we want to inform our partners with and our stakeholders with before we even start going down the path of we need.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is you're proposing almost a two-step. Step number one, we want to tell you all of our potential partners, what our plans are for R3. Once that's done, then step two is we're going to look for engagement asks.
Right. I believe if you do that, then what's going to happen is they're going to be able to come back with initiatives that you wouldn't have ever even thought about.
Okay, so good feedback. And let's consider that for a second. And this sort of is where I wanted to pause and say, are you sure you need this thing we're calling a summit? Because there's a lot of pieces involved. You're going to be hearing, you're going to get pressure from individual partner groups saying, hey, we need to know what's going on. You guys need to get us together. You may be getting pressure from your organization saying, hey, you really need to have an R3 summit because I've heard 5 other states have had one. But at the end of the day, as was indicated by several of the comments, do you know why you're doing this thing? Number one, and maybe most important, are you prepared for what's going to happen after you do it? Because keep in mind, we're dealing with organizations that have a mission, passionate individuals, folks that really believe in what they're doing, and being informed of what's going on that they have a vested stake in may just lead to more questions. They may be like, okay, great, but now what? Was I a part of this? What do you want me to do now? How is this going to serve my organization? So I think it's worthwhile to stop for a minute and say, wait a minute, where are we as an organization? Are we ready to get all these folks together? Are we ready to open this conversation for where it might lead? And this theme of where it might lead, this is where Taniya and I have just reams of scars. Seeing when you open that conversation up, when you build up expectation about one of these events, you're going to start some things in motion, whether you like it or not. So before you do that, let's consider, are you ready for this? Now, there's a bunch of different ways probably you could think about, are we ready for this? Do we need this kind of a summit as we've defined it? But after Taniya and I have helped multiple states through, during, and after, and picked up the pieces or enjoyed the successes of it, we would recommend there's some things you ought to do, or there's some helpful exercises to do to know for sure, are we ready for this thing or not? So we're going to call these stepping to the summit. And tonight we're going to break this part or break this down into kind of like 3 parts. So step number 1, figure out who those people are. Right at the beginning, Matt, I think it was you that said, when I asked you how many partners, you're thinking, well, 20, 30. Most of us actually don't know how many we have, what their history is with our organization, how many are just floating around out there in the universe, and therefore we don't know any pitfalls we might step in if we get these people together, who we include, who we exclude, what their expectations are. And so you can get all these folks together in a room, and the thing just blows up on you because you had no idea who you've left out, who's never been invited before, who has history, and you don't have a clear idea of what's going to happen because of those expectations when you get them all in a room. So ideally, before we do this, we want to know who are our R3 partners. And let's constrain that a little bit, because if we just say agency partners in general, I promise you folks, I've done this, it's going to be in the hundreds. So maybe let's constrain this to R3. What's our relationship and history? What do they need? What do they expect our agency to provide? What do they think we do? Do we have a plan for them? Do they have a plan for us? All of these questions are pretty significant when you think about a future partnership where you and another organization and the people within that are going to be interacting with each other for a common goal. So this is a placeholder slide. Read this later, but essentially there's sort of, I think is useful to find all your groups and then put them into 5 categories describing the relationship with your agency. Let me give you a quick example. Here's how this can work. So step number 1, you spend some time honestly online and talking with folks, and you make a master list of all those entities and organizations, state, national, local, county, municipal even, that might have a vested interest in R3. You're probably going to be in the dozens up to potentially over 100, depending on the size of your agency. Again, this is based on experience. And then it's good to look at that list and start asking some questions. Okay, here's some examples of how those organizations might fit into buckets. Institutional trust. That means you and this other partner group have a long history as organizations of working with each other and helping each other. And that relationship kind of transcends any tiffs that might happen with individuals. Good, solid working relationship through history. You put those organizations in the institutional trust bucket. Then you've got what we call the institutional transactional bucket. Maybe not as much history. They have a mission, you have a mission. This is the Artemis's logo, by the way. And you tend to collaborate if there's a mutual program, a mutual event that kind of helps both of you, but that's about it. We scratch your back, you scratch ours, but when there's not an opportunity, yeah, we don't intersect. Then you have, remember, organizations are just people's sitting in seats. We tend to think an organization is an entity. It isn't. An organization is just what we describe, a bunch of humans sitting in chairs doing stuff together. So within your organization, you'll probably have I call them bridge builders, but individuals that have a relationship with another organization, maybe because they're a particular member, maybe they attend, maybe it's something important in their personal life, but you as an organization have never been had done everything with that organization an individual in your agency has a relationship with. But that's good to map, because if you want to break into that organization, you have somebody, you have an ambassador who's really vested. Well, so you want to put those organizations in another bucket. The fourth bucket, it's like individual trust, where you have a person within your agency that has some involvement with another group, but they're not super vested. They have participated with them. Maybe they've invited another group to an event and it didn't really work out, but at least there's some communication between an individual in your organization and an individual in another organization, but it needs some work. There's not really quite a trust there. And then finally, you'll have a bunch of groups, most groups that your agency has had no history with. There's no individuals in your organization that has a relationship with them, and you have no organizational to organizational relationship. They're floating out there. When you do this, you're going to end up with something like this. This actually came from Virginia. 123 organizations is what they found. And after spending some time as an with sort of an interagency team, they mapped out all of their stakeholders into these individual buckets. So they had a future map to know, okay, who's out there, who's waiting in the wings, and then more importantly, what's our history with them? So it's kind of the first part of you understanding how big your R3 world is. Kind of important before you have a summit where you claim as an organization, we're inviting our most important or priority audiences. If you don't do this, how do you know that? And how do you know who you might be leaving out? So that's the first step. You put everybody in these buckets. Now, the next thing you want to do is you have to get to know them a little bit more. You can do this via survey, which is what I recommend. Taniya is going to drop in the chat an example of a survey she recently did in Texas, where you send some information out to all of those stakeholders, in case of Virginia, all 123, and you ask them some stuff. What's your R3 vision? Who do you focus on? What kind of capacity do you have? What are your expectations for our organization? What do you need to do what you do more? So you can start to build this essentially code with each organization that you can use to decide how to engage them in the future. Once that's done, you're going to have to make some hard decisions. And I'm going to introduce in here an idea we'll probably come back for later. Sorry that I'm going fast through this. We've only got an hour. So I want to introduce ideas that we can discuss later, or you can talk to us offline about a little bit more. The reality is, folks, every stakeholder represents a relationship that's going to take your time, your resources, and your energy. You only have so much. You only have so much staff. You only have so many hours in a day. So you're going to have to prioritize what you can get involved with and find where there's strategic holes where you need a partner, but you currently haven't developed one. When you've done that, you have to develop a strategy. How are we going to engage the ones we need to keep? How are we going to re-engage those we may have lost or hurt? How are we going to on-road some new ones? All thinking about how do we move through time into the future and keep the ones we've got engaged while increasing the ones that we need. Now here's a snapshot of once you've done this work, a type of table you can create. Thanks to Taniya for giving us this example. Over here, you can see the name of the organization. Primary contact. Here's our relationship, institutional trust. So this is an example where, hey, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, long history with the agency, good institutional trust. This one down here, color in the outdoors, individual trust. It means you got an employee working in your agency that is highly vested and has good trusting relationships with that group, but their group, that group and your agency haven't really done much together. And if you look over to the right, you can start to see where you layer in all of these data that you've collected through this mapping process, the programs they do, the target audience they're interested in. We're going to talk about ORAM mapping. It's a good thing to put in there. Where do they fit in the ORAM in general? What part of the pathway to becoming a hunter do they most influence? What's their expectations of the agency? What are their top barriers? Next things you want to do. You can do this, maybe not for all 120, but at least for your top tier ones after you've made those decisions. Who do we focus on? Where are our gaps? This is so valuable. It'll help you decide not only should we have a summit, but specifically, how do we engage in a bunch of other ways based on what our partners need. Taniya.
So up until now, we've been talking a lot about how we frame up what's going on in the landscape already. Who are the partners and what do they do and what's our relationship with them, right? We're asking those external questions. And this is before we ever decide we actually are going to have a partner summit. This is all leading up to the framework of structuring your partner engagements. So once you've figured out who's out there, what are they doing, what do they need, what are their expectations for us, then you need to look internally, and those can happen at the same time. But you want to make sure you're looking internally, and if you could click one more time for me, Matt, to this step 2, which is figure out what's already going on inside your organization. One more click, please. So you want to find out what's going on inside. Go ahead and just click all the way through it to number 3. I don't know why I left the animations in here. So this first one is organizational baseline data. You got to figure out like where your customer base is at, what's going on, what trends are happening with your data. And we're going to crack into a little bit more details after this. You also want to make sure that, as Matt mentioned earlier, that you're identifying what the participation gaps are for customer pathways. You also want to make sure that you're referencing any organizational guidance documents that would dictate how things like resources are to be spent. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about each of these pieces and how they help you get further towards making this decision of how you are going to engage different partners and to what extent and whether you've got the capacity and the very specific clear pathway forward to do the proper care and feeding of partners. So first thing we talked about was organizational baseline data. This is things like licensing data. You know, do you have a dashboard from your licensing team where you can take a look at license type and where your highest areas of churn are? Can you take a look at your age and gender demographics and see where those churn rates are and maybe identify some really key poignant opportunities that your agency wants to go to work on? Because those opportunities might tie you to specific partner groups so you can be working in tandem with one another to achieve specific shared goals. Next slide. So of course, those objectives would be a part of an ORAM process. Other kinds of baseline data that you also should be gathering is, anything you can get your hands on is going to help you paint a complete picture of what the current customer engagement and partner engagement processes look like in your state. So from this perspective, the data that you could also include would be things like event registration information. Who's signing up for our programs? Who's not taking the next step after they've taken a program? What kinds of engagement are we having through our programmatic efforts? You can also look at your census data and trends and find out, well, what kind of folks live where in our state and what do those folks' participation look like? The next one could be results from things like attitude surveys or social listening projects that, again, are helping you keep a pulse on the kinds of opportunities and objectives that you as an agency may want to be setting and that might determine the kinds of partnerships that you need moving forward. This image is one of my favorite tools I've ever seen, and it's a Esri geo-enrichment tool that uses customer purchasing behavior, tax codes, to determine where fishing equipment is being purchased, and then how far those people have to travel to get to fishing access. And so this was a way to determine placement of fishing locations, and it pointed out some really hardcore opportunities that the state of South Dakota had for generating and increasing access to fishing opportunities. If you've got partners that also care about fishing in those communities, those would be obvious logical pathways forward in those relationships. So these are all internal, what's going on inside and with our customer data points that can provide defensible information to use with your partners as you're figuring out your approach. Next slide, please. So one thing that's really interesting, what's the point of using any one of those pieces? Big picture is that any one of those things, whether it's ORAM mapping or those data sources or using a gap analysis within your organization or a SWOT analysis, any one of these tools, the whole point is that you're identifying gaps and opportunities. There's many different ways to do that. You have to do it before you start reaching out. We don't want this to be throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks with partner engagement. These relationships are far too important to randomly approach without a plan and without very clear objectives. So these tools, ORAM mapping, we've got videos about that. Matt's been involved in creating those videos and trainings at the R3 Symposium. I've helped organizations ORAM map over time. It's basically a way of saying, what kind of offerings are there available on the landscape to determine, to support participants along their journey from beginner to a lasting lifelong participant in hunting, shooting sports, fishing, or boating. And it's pretty clear that you can identify gaps in those pathways. And again, those gaps and opportunities help drive what our customer and partner engagement approaches look like. And you can take the results from an ORAM map or take the results from a gap analysis or SWOT, and it's going to show you those opportunities, those opportunities that are rich for the picking, and what you need are ripe for the picking. And what you need to do is you take those opportunities you're identifying, those are your potential growth or development opportunities, and you compare them side by side with what your agency's non-negotiables are. Hunter education is typically a non-negotiable. Those resources are fixed. You can't do a lot with that outside of what is legally obligated by our agencies to provide. And so that is a fixed piece. And see if once we take care of this fixed piece, what are the other amounts of capacity or resources we still have internally to put towards growth and development opportunities. Okay, so take a look at your non-negotiables and also look at what's already being done. And rather than developing something new, maybe there's an opportunity to level up something that's already happening. So these are all the components that you're using to look inside your organization and figure out, okay, what do we have going on? So next slide really quickly. This is just a couple of illustrations of ORAM mapping. This was during a training that occurred at the R3 Symposium. Again, you're identifying offerings, and you can include partner offerings in your ORAM map so you can see on the landscape, are we already loaded up on recruitment events and opportunities? Do we as an organization need to lean in on retention? Do our partners, do we need partners to fill this gap that we have in retention or reactivation programs? Just being very intentional about identifying gaps and opportunities is happening. And I want to highlight this. It's happening way before you plan a partner summit. You are designing your partner engagement strategy with this information in mind. I think that's the key point here. Next piece, next slide. Here, I want to offer some course correction. So Matt talked about our reams of scars, right? Like we've been through many state engagement, back one slide for me, many different state engagement and organizational engagement opportunities where we've seen this go many different ways. And one thing that we see happening often is that an agency will go to a list of 100 partners and say, oh, let us know if you can help in any way, or help us in any way you can, right? Like, how many of you have heard those words coming out your mouth? I know I have. Or whatever you've got would be wonderful, right? I mean, that's nice and all, but it doesn't give me any sideboards on what I might be able to uniquely lean in on and whether I'm a good fit or not. So the best thing you can do when you go into partner engagements is you've got very clear objectives in mind from your ORAM, SWOT analysis, your mapping efforts, and you know, man, we have a need specifically for perhaps female specific retention efforts for you to be able to go to a particular partner and say, you are uniquely poised with these resources to meet the specific need. Make sure that you are being clear, and it saves a lot of time and running around in that relationship, and it helps partners identify very clearly what their role could be in a future relationship with the agency. So make sure when you're approaching partners, again, you've got very specific asks that are informed by all the data Matt and I have just been talking about collecting. Next slide. So this last piece that I hit on earlier was about the importance of organizational guidance documents. Anytime you're about to go do something really big with a bunch of other folks, you better make sure it's nested within your agency's guiding direction, right? So like If there are any R3 guidance documents, whether it's an R3 plan, hopefully an statewide strategic plan of sorts that includes objectives around partner engagement or R3, reference that, again, before moving ahead with anything like a summit or a big movement with partners. Reference that and see, where does my leadership support lie? What's the direction that we're trying to head as an agency? Because we know that the objectives that are in agency-wide guidance documents are objectives that everyone is expecting clear deliverables from, right? They're waiting for resources to be allocated to very specific objectives and waiting for those metrics to come back. So if you're going to be doing work outside of those desired objectives, it's going to be an uphill battle. So make sure that you're in alignment with what the guidance documents are directing the agency to do, where those resources are allocated, where the leadership support rests, and also making sure that your partner engagement has the support from that guiding document, right? That it's nested, your partner engagement plan is nested within those strategic guidance documents. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, with having clear asks for our partners, it's also essential to have really clear expectations laid out. Matt referenced earlier, you got to have a plan for what's going on with your partner engagement. It's what's next, and not just what's next, but where are we aiming with this? Again, we've seen folks that are holding R3 partner summits because like 5 other states had a partner summit. It's the next thing we're supposed to do, but the partner summit is as far as people have thought. And not only does that limit the development of an agenda that's meaningful and creating lasting change, but it also, after you get 20, 30, 50 people in the same room, very excited to work with you, and they leave, all that momentum fizzles out if there's not an obvious next step. And that can harm relationships more quickly than it can help. So be intentional with partner engagement. Make sure you've got clear objectives. Make sure you've got a plan and where you want this to go. And up next, Matt is going to talk us through, again, what are the conditions under which you would decide to move ahead with a partner summit?
Thanks, Taniya. Okay. I know how much we just threw at you in the past 25, 30 minutes. So let me give you an anchoring analogy. I want you all to think about your friend groups. I want you to think about your best friends. I want you to think about who are your casual acquaintances you'll get together for a barbecue with, or some event maybe with your kids or some other friends. And then people like on this call that you see at conferences, that you see at meetings. While they're there, you have sometimes. You recognize these tiers? Now, what I want you to also think about is how much energy does it take on your part to move one of those people inward? One of those folks closer to a good friend that you're going to text when you have a funny thought, when you've got a great picture to send that you're going to forward, maybe when you really need some help, you want to reach out. I want you to think about the energy that that takes to move people from an outer shell to an inner shell. And the fact that you as a human create these shells because you have finite time, resources, and needs. What we've done up to now, Taniya and I are proposing, honestly, a selfish approach to partnering. Okay? We have said, step number 1, look outward. Look at all of your partners, potential partners, like you would look at all the people you might be friends with and say, okay, where do they actually sit? What do I know about them? What do they need? What do they expect from me? But it's still from a position of, I need to understand them some more before I decide how or if I'm going to move them inward. Then the second thing that we did was tonight talked about, let's look honestly within ourselves. Sometimes you're at a point in life where, frankly, you can't have many friends and you need just 1 or 2 because there's so much going on. There's other times when life's going good, you got a lot of resources, you have a supportive social milieu, and guess what? It doesn't take as much energy to bring folks in. So these first 2 steps, what we're proposing to you before you have a summit is do that work first so that you can make sure you are in a good place to partner strategically, to build relationships constructively, and then maybe most importantly, you don't overextend yourself or them and build bad expectations that in a year, 2 years, maybe 6 months, they become a broken bridge that you then have to rebuild. At the premise of our assumptions, well, at the premise of this approach is here's our one assumption. You literally cannot do everything for everybody. And that Taniya said this right at the end of her talk, you will do harm. You'll do relational harm to a partner group if you try to be everything for everybody. So this is where it gets hard. Here's where we'll bring it home. You have decision time based on all those data that you've collected. If you've done these first 2 steps and you've been honest with yourself, you now have a decision. Are you ready for the commitment that's going to come when you bring a bunch of people together? And they're at the end of this event, most of them are going to have one primary question. I guarantee you this is it because I've surveyed a bunch of them. The primary question they have is, what next? Now what? What's going to happen now? They're telling you, I expect a relationship to start building here. How are we going to keep this work going? If your answer is, I don't know, wait and see, I promise you, you're going to break more trust than you're going to build it. So here's my rule of thumb. If you aren't ready to engage in a 3 to 5 year relationship with every single group you're inviting there, if you can't see a pathway to the next 3 years, if you can't see the staff capacity, if you can't see the time involved for the next 3 to 5 years, don't have a summit. You're not ready. Instead, take a different partnership approach potentially, more one-on-one, more, hey, we're going to look at what our 3 efforts we're doing right now, and we're going to make some specific asks of specific groups, but we're not going to bring this big thing in here. We may post our new strategic plan and maybe send an email to everybody and say, hey, here's our strategic plan, here's where we're moving forward. But you don't build up their expectations by all getting them in this one place and saying, oh, you're all an equal part, because the reality is they're not. You're not ready for them all to be an equal part. So I think there's 2 conditions. If you are ready to do that commitment, if you can see a pathway there, then go ahead and have a summit if one of these 2 things is true. You're about to launch like the development of a new strategic plan, or maybe an implementation plan of a strategy with your agency, and you need partner buy-in and feedback. Hey, what do you all think? What do you see your part in this? Again, you still have to be prepared to be with them for 3 to 5 years, even before you ask for that engagement. Because if you don't, once you take all their engagement, you say, hold tight, wait and see, they're going to sit there going, well, why did you invite me in the first place if you guys really aren't going to follow up? Second condition, if you've made an active stakeholder plan, you've done the work we've talked about in these first 2 steps, and you have identified exactly who you're going to move to the inner shells, who you're going to keep in the inner shells, where there are gaps in your R3 efforts that you need some help with, and you're strategically going to make strategic asks, as Taniya talked about, of particular partners, and you want them involved in the future engagement, again, that 3 to 5 years, and you have a plan for that engagement. Okay. Let's pause here because we have probably done some controversial things, maybe taken a direction you didn't really expect, maybe said some stuff that you disagree with. So let's pause here a little bit, and I'm going to kick it back to Taniya let's do some Q&A and maybe some reflection.
That'd be great. If you don't mind stopping the screen share. One of the questions I have for you all that I would love to hear some responses back from you about, we've talked about deciding whether you even have a summit today. Was anybody surprised that we might discourage you from having a summit at this particular point in time, or that there may be criteria to having a summit? Is anybody surprised by that?
Yeah, I thought everybody loved commitment. So, I mean, but it does make sense though, because we all got a certain size plate, right, that we can put stuff on, and this may add too many plates or add too much on your plate. So it does make me step back a minute and say, oh yeah, I'm excited about it. I want to be all warm and fuzzy with everybody, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have to be if we already have enough on our plate. So that does take a little bit of pressure off me per se, as that next thing, because we are getting ready to finish out our R3 plan and try to bring it out there to the world. And why can't they be done in an email or a Zoom meeting or something like that? So it definitely helps me maybe not have to do this so soon. I guess I could say, maybe down the road, once we start figuring out who those stakeholders are.
Yeah, and there's some very intentional pieces you could start putting into place now, mapping folks out or doing some analysis on who's out there and who has what resources to their availability. And that can happen without that added obligation of having a massive event to plan on top of it. Along those lines, right? You just mentioned email, or maybe we talked earlier about just a webinar, perhaps. Along those lines, I'd like to hear from the group, what are some of those other kinds of engagement that might be a better fit for where you are right now? If you are saying, actually, no, we don't have the capacity to manage 200 brand new relationships, or actually, no, it's not the right time for a partner summit. What are some of those other kinds of things that you can engage with people through?
I think one thing that we're trying to do with our NGOs and partners is we're trying to push information. We're trying to push white papers, scientific papers, information associated with the agency that just kind of keeps them engaged with what we're doing. And that way, whenever we're ready to start doing a summit, and summit doesn't have to be 100 people, it could be just our, like you mentioned earlier, Matt, our 5 best friends. And, keep it small, keep it tight for now until we get our feet up under us. But that constant push of information has been really helpful.
That's awesome. And so maybe that's happening through like one-on-one conversations. Maybe it's happening through small group meetings or through trainings that are being offered, or smaller sessions and like that. And I hope that through today's conversation, you can see that those engagements aren't necessarily the same thing as a partner summit, right? Like this big culmination of effort and time and energy, that it's more like the care and feeding of relationships and calibration with each other to see what does this overlap of work look like potentially in the future, right? But there's difference and nuance there. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just add, based on what Jeremy, you're saying, a good point here that I was hoping was come up. Not having a summit as we defined at the beginning doesn't mean you can't have a meeting. And Taniya used a couple words like a workshop. If you want to basically invite all of your partners, or a broad range of them, and say, hey, we're going to bring some people in and do some R3 basic education for our staff and maybe for you all, since we know you're vested. Come in and learn with us. At least there you've narrowed the relationship. You said we're here to learn together, and you could do a little bit of agency announcement. So that kind of a thing absolutely can be a different form of engagement that you can keep your partners involved without the expectation that a summit, the way we've defined it, often creates.
Great point. Absolutely. And I think, Matt, you even talked about this too, of like, sometimes I just need to find out who my new partners are. Sometimes it's just the care and feeding of new relationships. And that could be as easy as taking somebody out for coffee. Or it could be, I've got a regular call scheduled quarterly to just check in with a new partner and just get to know who they are, see where we might overlap in the work that we do, and get familiar with each other's faces. Or it might be a point of attending somebody else's event and then see, hey, is there a vibe check? Is their vibe fit here? As I see them in their space, maybe there's an overlap I can identify of resources we've got that might help them out. You can do those kinds of investigation. Anybody else have either surprised that we might discourage you from doing a partner summit if you don't have the right structure, or have other ways that partners can be engaged?
I think one thing that came out of our recent stakeholder forum that we had was partnering partners with partners, mapping out your partner list and helping those partners connect with other partners. Some partners have audiences, some partners have resources. Can they get together without needing to come through the gatekeeper being the department? So is there a way you can help facilitate those relationships on their own? We also throw around the idea about sharing resources as far as equipment or gear and things like that. Is there a possibility for this organization has a bunch of kayaks and this organization's got a bunch of audiences? Hey, can y'all host an event together where now those audiences have access to the kayaks without needing to go find your own equipment? So, I think creating that type of map that you had shared a while ago, that stakeholder map, and be able to share that with your partners to help them find other resources around the state. And that's not a huge lift on the department side, setting that up initially, gathering the information through potential surveys, creating that document, sharing it with your partners, and letting them facilitate those own relationships.
Excellent point, Jason. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, absolutely. Partners can benefit from one another as well, and you can just be a facilitator and connector in some of those spaces.
The other thing
I'd
to
love-
think about.
Jake had his hand up.
Oh,
Yep.
go ahead.
Jason, go ahead and finish, and then it's Jake.
The other thing to think about is, are there some organizations that are recruitment focused and some organizations that are retention focused? Can those partners work together? Like, hey, we work with youth, we get them some experience, some trial. You do more of that retention, that ongoing, social support. Can those groups partner up where now they're coming through my recruitment activities through my organization, and then I help funnel them to that next organization that does more of the retention side of things. So partnering there where the retention folks aren't having to recruit as much and the recruitment folks aren't having to retain as much. They can just pass them through and kind of create that fluid motion through the steps.
Excellent point. I think one thing that I noticed coming up in your conversations was how many people thought they had to do all of it themselves. So I really appreciate you bringing that up as a way of being able to specialize what you're really naturally good at or have access to specific resources for. Excellent point, Jason. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah. What Jason was talking about kind of triggered an idea. We offer at-cost trainings for partners. A lot of those are free. And in being intentional about who you invite, whether it's like a neutral area or at a partner site, is like a really almost informal way to have a captive audience and then them meet together and do a common purpose. And it helps justify it to the higher ups. It's like, yeah, I have to go get this archery training, but at the same time they're networking as they do it. So just who you invite, and where you do it can help a lot, and two birds, one stone it.
I love that. Actually, Jake, do you mind giving a very specific example of a location and who might have been invited to that space?
Sure. So I work in Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and then we have a youth network that I'm a part of. I'm a coordinator. So we have on the other side of the coin youth centers that we run with FWC staff. So my local one's in Apollo Beach. It's called Suncoast Youth Conservation Center. It's marine science focused, and we have a lot of trainings there where we'll invite a bunch of different folks there. We had a leadership program for people of color in paddle sports, 4-day training, and we had 4 different partners represented: Outdoor Afro, Get Black Outside, some organizations like that, and that was a really, really awesome experience. But everything from we'll have archery at a local city park, Boyd Hill, and then we'll invite multiple partners to that. So sometimes you have more intention than others, but there are people that would have never met each other had it not been for that opportunity to get together and do an archery training or paddle sport or any of the other things that we do. So
awesome. Thank you for sharing that insight into how you guys have done it in Florida. Appreciate that, Jake.
Mm-hmm.
David.
So another thing, it sounds simple. It requires a lot of coordination, a little bit on inside of the organization, but being able to share different events that your partners are engaged in or things that they're planning on doing. Because a lot of times, even folks inside your organization have no clue what these different organizations are doing, and it helps them understand how they can support. But it also, if you put it out to your partners, helps them understand how they can support each other as well. So the more that you are able to share, now, of course, you're not going to be able to share every event that's going on, but where you can talk about, hey, look, this organization is going to be hosting 30 youths in hunting. If you can go out and support them or give them some advice on some of the things, just sharing information with one another and creating that, I won't say a clearinghouse, but creating that kind of social network amongst the partners. Because one of the great things that we're learning that partners can also do for us is create social networks for those that we're bringing out that don't have their own built-in social networks, so they can keep the activities going. Because one of the things that everybody knows is for folks to really get into something, it takes multiple positive opportunities to do it. But if there's no social network where they can continue, then more than likely they're not going to do it. But if you've got partners that are doing different activities and you can point folks to those different partners so they can develop those social networks and those different environments where they can continue to do it, it's beneficial to everybody, including the organization. And so the more we can publicize or help our partners publicize activities they're doing, I think the better.
Make it easy for our shared customer base to find things to do together. I think that's a phenomenal point, David. Thank you for sharing that.
It is, and I would even elevate a certain part of that. If you think back to that grid that actually I'm going to share my screen here real quick so you can see that grid again. If you think about that grid that you can build.
Yeah.
Got it? Okay.
Yep.
You can think about this that you build while you're building these data, when you're talking to your partners, if you send out a survey, if you do some structured interviews, ask them how much of this could you share with other partners? And frequently they'll say, well, I don't want this to go public, but if there are other R3 partners, and you can even provide them a list and say, hey, here's who we're counting. We've done stakeholder mapping. Here's who is really vested in R3 in this state. Would you mind sharing some of this information with them? If you ask that in the survey, if you ask that in the interviews, then you're going to get a whole bunch of data that you could just share. And if all those partners can see each other's needs, if they can see each other's barriers, David, what you were just saying, that it can be so actionable and easy. All you have to do is, as an agency, is provide the content, and they kind of find each other because they've got a primary contact. They understand what each partner is going through and where there might be synergy. This has been done a couple times in the past with various agencies, and it works really, really well. But the key is you got to remember to ask to be able to share that data on the front end as opposed to the back end.
I think one thing that I saw that enhances that is just adding, like, what resources do you as an organization have access to that you'd be willing to share in partnership, and documenting. And so somebody can say, oh my gosh, they've got access to an entire fleet of transportation vehicles, for example. Or holy smokes, this group over here is workforce development for conservation professionals. We can take folks that have funneled through these programs and offer them working opportunities or whatever. There's natural pathways between partners. But hopefully today has helped to highlight some of the decisions you need to make and information that will help you create meaningful and intentional partner engagement strategies, or help make the decision of whether you actually need a partner summit or a different kind of engagement strategy outside of that. Matt, any parting words on that front?
Thank you for your patience and wandering around in Taniya and I's brain for a while. Hopefully it was entertaining, if nothing else. Also, in terms of resources, Olivia, we'll send you this presentation. You can send that out to everybody so you all have these examples. And any questions that you have about resources, where this has been done, what you can do, Olivia will also share our email addresses and contact information, so please feel free to reach out. I would love to save you all from scars if Taniya and I already have them, and we're just happy to be in that position to help you if we can.
Thanks for inviting us in. We look forward to seeing you guys in November.